Welcome to Research Reviews, the series where I use the platform of YouTube to practice for my own college exams. In this episode, I will cover the Sonderweg thesis, a thesis that underpinned an entire course at my university. After covering the thesis, I will give my personal opinion about the shortcomings of this thesis. So, what is the Sonderweg? The Sonderweg in itself means unique path, and the thesis states that Germany walked down its own path when compared to the rest of Europe. There are many variations by many different historians, with the most important distinction being between the positive and the negative Sonderweg. The positive Sonderweg states that Germany's unique path was a gloriously unique one, leading to a strong and unified nationalistic and dominant Germany. The popularity of this popular Sonderweg took a nosedive after the horrors the Germans inflicted during the Second World War. And the second one is the negative Sonderweg, which I will be focusing on. This theory was largely developed and popularized in an attempt to explain how Germany could have possibly regressed to the point of committing countless atrocious acts during the Second World War. The main statement the negative Sonderweg makes is that Hitler was an exceptional person that could only have come to power in Germany and nowhere else because of Germany's unique history. In this video, I will examine this thesis in two parts. In the first section, I will explain how the Sonderweg sees German history, and in the second section, I will explain how Germany's post-war behavior was influenced by the Sonderweg. A massive point of divergence the Sonderweg thesis assigns to Germany when compared with other European nations comes with the French Revolution. At the start of the French Revolution, German intellectuals, like many others across the continent, happily supported the constitutional monarchy and the social equality it provided. But when the French Revolution radicalized, the sympathy started to diminish. Especially after the French turned expansionist and occupied Germany for a decade, there was little support for the French Revolution after that point. Where in France liberalism had taken hold, in German circles a new narrative emerged, that the French resorted to revolution because the French people were morally incapable of slow and orderly reform, like how the German intellectuals saw their own societal progress. So, what was this progress that Germany experienced? Well, from 1810 to 1822, the German states, and most importantly Prussia, massively reorganized their governments to be more unitary and efficient in order to stand up against the future French aggression. Secondly, they modernized their economies, becoming more of a free capitalist market economy. But perhaps more importantly, many German states freed their farmers from direct noble influence. Many German states also implemented a weak parliamentary constitution, giving the air of political progress. Then finally, the Germans started working together in a more comprehensive manner through the German Bond. Where the Holy Roman Empire was a weak and ancient institution, only nominally binding the Germans together through the Habsburg Empire, the German Bond was a more comprehensive and equal partnership, despite Austria still being the leading state. What made most of this societal progress possible was a status quo between the progressive liberalism from the top and monarchist conservatism from the bottom. Thanks to this status quo, Prussia and many other German states became effective and organized states, but heavily autocratic ones. The proponents of the Sonderweg see this Prussian way of modernizing their nation as the first building step towards the rise of Hitler. The key to this modernization was a highly efficient state, but also a highly militarized and autocratic one. A pattern that, as we'll soon see, will not be broken by later German generations. The next important checkpoint for the Sonderweg comes to us in 1848, where the German question requires an answer. The first question is who should unify Germany? Our first unification candidate is obviously Prussia, and while they were a relatively small power compared to France, Britain, Austria or Russia, they were a highly efficient and militarized nation. The second candidate was Austria, a very large but ineffective power, having a divided population seeking autonomy from within the Austrian Empire. These two countries would go on to have a struggle for German domination between 1815 and 1864, which intensified as time went on. The second question is how should Germany be unified? While the idea of unification had mass popularity across the German state and classes, a big question remained of how it should look. Autocracy or democracy? Centralized or decentralized? Should the entire Austrian Empire be included? Should only the German-speaking territories of the Austrian Empire be included? Or should Austria just be excluded altogether? It is argued by proponents of the Sonderweg thesis that these exact questions were the key to the future of Germany, and not just how it looked on the map. With a small German solution, excluding Austria, Prussia would lead Germany as a Protestant, autocratic, militaristic and centralized German state. If instead, a Greater Germany was formed, including Austria, there would have to be a balance of power within the German Empire, between Vienna and Berlin, meaning a less centralized and more balanced German leadership, as the inclusion of Austria would be a balancer from within the empire. If the non-German Austrian territories were also to be included, then the empire would need to think of how to deal with those territories, as military domination would not be sustainable in the long term. So, according to the Sonderweg thesis, during the early 19th century, two key decisions were taken that ensured Germany's path into militarism and autocracy. The first was the founding of the Zollverein, which linked the economies of many German states and deliberately excluded Austria, meaning increased Prussian control over the minor German states. But the final opportunity for a democratic and liberal Germany died in 1848. With the revolution year came a call for a unified Germany under a democratic constitutional monarchy led by Prussia. But the King of Prussia declined the crown of the German Empire since he didn't agree with the many constitutional restrictions it would put on his monarchy. After this moment, any chance for peaceful and democratic German unification has died, and anyone who sought both the unification of Germany and liberalism now had to pick between the two. You could either choose for freedom and try to liberalize the individual German states, or you could choose for unity. But that would mean supporting the autocratic Prussia as the unification candidate for Germany, since Austria was very openly opposed to full German unification at the time. But then came the man who would single-handedly decide the future of Germany, Bismarck. If there was any hope left for democratic Germany, Bismarck killed it. Bismarck wanted a Germany led by Prussia as a strong autocratic monarchy, and foresaw a unification with Austria as an obstacle to this. Bismarck predicted that including Austria would lead to a weak and divided Germany, too busy bickering over centralization, religion, modernization, militarism, etc. By excluding Austria, Bismarck wanted to secure a unified and Prussian Germany. After Austria and Prussia fought a war in 1866, Bismarck prevented any land from being taken from the defeated Austrians. On the one hand, to prevent revanchism from the Austrians in the future, but also to completely end the debate about the future borders of Germany. Austria was not to join Germany. This was solidified when, after the Franco-Prussian War, the German Empire was indeed declared as a Prussian-led, Protestant-dominated, centralized autocracy. So now, according to many proponents of the Sonderweg, we have fallen into the bad timeline for Germany. Bismarck would embark upon a policy of internal strength, reconciling with the other European powers and seeking to keep Germany small but unified. Bismarck would start social programs to help the workers and the poor in Germany and, at least on paper, introducing democracy to the nation. A parliament did exist, and Bismarck ensured that there was full male suffrage in Germany, meaning that every single man could vote. Did he do these things because he believed in democracy and socialism? Absolutely not. Quite the opposite, actually. With these actions, Bismarck secured the domination of the conservatives in Germany. As with social programs in place and full male suffrage, what were the socialists and the liberals going to complain about now? This would ensure that conservatism remained the strongest ideology among the German population, since after all, the conservatives were in power and they gave us full democracy and social protections and programs. But then came Wilhelm II, who stopped Bismarck's internal focus and sought to establish a more assertive Germany on the world stage. His policies of aggression and his military build-up would drive France, Britain and Russia into each other's arms and led directly to the First World War. The Sonderweg thesis proposed that this aggressive German behavior, and especially the actions of Wilhelm II and his Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, as the main cause for World War I. With the defeat of Germany in said World War I came a troubled period of democracy. In the years of 1918 and 1919, revolutions rocked the nation as the Peace of Versailles was being negotiated between the victorious powers. Communist rebels tried to establish a council republic in Germany as a new republic was declared in Weimar. This government in Weimar signed the Peace of Versailles, leading to an instant discrediting of this government and the rise of the so-called Dolchstoß legende, a popular idea in interwar Germany explaining their defeat in World War I by blaming the liberal government, the socialists and later the Jews, who supposedly sold out the military who were still fighting in France. After all, how can you lose a war when you are still in control over all of your territory and even hold the lands of your enemies? The Weimar Republic was birthed in issues. As political unrest ruled Berlin, the government settled into the relatively minor town of Weimar. In 1923, the Germans were faced with the occupation of the Rhineland due to their failure to repay war debts to the French. This led to mass inflation in the nation, as the government printed money to keep paying the wages of workers that laid down their work in the Rhineland. The status quo ended when America started a program where they lent money to Germany so Germany could repay France and Britain, and France and Britain could in turn repay the money they lent from America during the war. This ended the Rhineland crisis and France retreated from the region, as German war debts were now being repaid again. After this crisis, the political life in Germany started to somewhat normalize, and a troubled democracy, to some extent, seemed to be working. But this ended in 1929, when the Great Recession happened. American loans dried up, causing the cycle of repayments from Germany to the Allies and from the Allies to America to stop as well. The liberal and open constitution of the Weimar Republic ensured that all political parties could participate, no matter the ideology or the size, leading to a great polarization between the radical communists and nationalists, as well as many minority governments, as radicals and smaller parties ate up many of the parliament seats. This led to a great polarization in the nation between the radical communists and the nationalists, as people blamed democracy for the troubles in the nation. Rule in the Republic was done more and more by emergency decree from the President and the Chancellor, and less from majority parliamentary rule. This culminated in the rise of Hitler, who secured his dictatorship by a similar emergency decree, and the disastrous consequences which he would unleash upon the world. The Second World War itself isn't really interesting in this story. According to the Sonderweg, Hitler continues the German nature of aggression, leading to the descent of the world into World War II. The horrific consequences, and especially the Holocaust, led to this creation of the Sonderweg thesis to explain how this could have happened. So, before I criticize the Sonderweg thesis, I will explain how within the two German states after World War II, the memory of war developed. In the Western Bundesrepublik, the story of the negative Sonderweg came into prominence. German historians had to deal with their own past and how they got there, and explained it by pointing a straight line between Bismarck, Wilhelm II and Hitler, and how there were only a couple of potential divergences from this path. When social movements rocked the Western world in the 60s, Germany was hit especially hard, as the generation of baby boomers were now beginning to grow up and had to come to terms with their nation's past. Despite not having participated in the horrific acts of the Nazis, they still had to deal with the fact that their parents and grandparents participated and lived through this Nazi period. During the 60s and the 70s, the Sonderweg was slightly altered as an idea was born that the history of Germany was not just to be put on some misguided men leading Germany down a dark path, but as a history of collective guilt. The German people chose unity over freedom. The German people rejected Weimar and elected Hitler, and the German people had their part to play in the path that Germany went down. During the 80s, a debate raged concerning the uniqueness of the Nazis, called the Historikerstreit. The more conservative German historians placed the Nazis on the same level as Soviet, colonial, Japanese or Allied atrocities, while proponents of the Sonderweg argued that Hitler and the Nazis were unique and should not be normalized by comparing them to other movements. But in East Germany, a different story emerged. German history in the DDR would have to be interpreted as the class struggle across history, which would then lead into the natural peak of history, communism. The two main parts of this communist new canon of German history was anti-fascism. They portrayed the Bundesrepublik as the successor to the Third Reich and its legacy, which essentially removed the East Germans from this narrative, while at the same time coupling their own state with previous revolutions in opposition to the autocratic powers across German history. This has caused the east of the country to have grown up on a radically different version of German history, one where there is no guilt to be had in the German past of the DDR. After unification, and especially under Chancellor Merkel, this idea of the uniqueness of German history lost much of its prominence, with 2005 being an important date for this. Slowly but steadily, Germany is starting to lose their uniqueness and is seeking to re-establish itself as a normal nation like any other one, just with different priorities. With the recent rearmament as a response to the Ukraine war, this normalization seems to have reached its peak, as Germany finally has found the courage to rearm despite its troubled past. Only time will tell if this is a permanent development though. Then finally, my own ideas and conclusions based on the Sonderweg thesis. To preface my criticisms, this thesis is a very large and diverse one, and my video has incorporated and left out parts of each of them for the sake of brevity and having an as unified narrative as possible. If I had to go through every German historian's version of the Sonderweg, we would have been here all day. But here are, in my opinion, some main points which exist in some versions of the Sonderweg narrative. I have a big issue with blaming the German people for their past. Just to clarify, most historians aren't saying that we should blame present-day Germans for their past, but they are blaming past Germans for not stopping the Sonderweg which we experienced. I personally think that blaming an entire people for not foreseeing ramifications years, decades, or centuries down the line is extremely unproductive. There was an implicit choice made for unity over freedom, at least in the short term. But if we look at the context at the time, this was a logical decision. The troubles which rocked Versailles were not the German people trying to overthrow democracy just so Hitler could commit atrocities. It was a desperate and humiliated people in great economic turmoil, seeking for someone to help them out of their desperate situation. Again, in their historical context, it makes a lot of sense that people liked and accepted Hitler's promises for the future of their country. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to say that someone or some people should have done some things differently. But you have to take into account, above all else, what the situation at the time was, what the people knew, and what the people needed. Then we have the fact that the Sonderweg thesis, by its very nature, is teleological. For the people who don't know, this essentially means that you're writing history with a distinct end result in mind, and instead of looking at history with at least attempted objectivity, the proponents of the Sonderweg thesis explain away or leave out many breaking points and simply call what we saw in history the logical progression of a larger trend. There is a reason I focus my chapters largely on specific men. These men have been reduced by the Sonderweg thesis as simple pawns on the road to Hitler, instead of their own actors seeking out their own goals. By linking everything, from Bismarck till Hitler, together in a simple and neat line leading to a naturally aggressive and authoritarian future, leaves out many potential shifting points. They point to the establishment of the small German solution and Bismarck as the breaking point towards Hitler and the Second World War. But what about if the Allies had served a milder Treaty of Versailles? Would Hitler still have risen? If the Great Recession hadn't happened or had arrived slightly later, would democracy still have failed in the same way? Had Germany not been treated as a pariah state after World War I, would they have sought aggression again? If Frederick III had become the German Kaiser instead of Wilhelm II, would he have led Germany into a less aggressive foreign policy, with a more liberal domestic policy? Would the First World War have happened the same way that it did in our own? All of these questions and more are simply dismissed by certain parts of the Sonderweg thesis, as they paint the line from Bismarck to Hitler as a clear and unstoppable one. Then to finish it off, we have the discussion on the uniqueness of Hitler and the Nazis. I personally think that it is very hurtful to historical discussion and the honest examination of history to examine a history in full isolation. No history is fully unique, and no two histories can be perfectly similar. Yes, there were certain aspects of German society which caused history to happen the way it did. Let's examine these specific causes and how they led to the outcome we got. But exploring how things could have easily been different is extremely valuable to discussion and research. But by stopping this research by insisting on the uniqueness of German history, you do a disservice to history itself. Hitler rose in Germany. but I doubt a Hitler-like figure could have only risen in Germany. Could a slightly more radical Mussolini not have acted in a similar way to Hitler in Italy? Are other fascist movements, fundamentally speaking, not extremely similar to Nazism? Yes, the Nazis were more extreme than most groups, but was this really down to German history or just happenstance? Let's try to find reasons for why history happened the way it did by comparing and spotting similarities and differences, while still being wary of explaining history in straight lines, inevitabilities, and uniqueness. I'm sorry, Germany. While you have your own unique history, it simply wasn't a Sonderweg on the road to Hitler. And that's it for this video. If you enjoyed the video, do leave a like and a comment. Even just commenting hi helps the channel out massively. As always, do subscribe for more. There will be a new alternate history video every Friday, as well as other videos on most Sundays and Wednesdays. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye.